Rodosvaldo Pozo was only a teenager when he was sent to prison in Cuba after being accused of burning sugarcane fields. In the last episode, he wouldn't say whether or not he really did it.
Did you do it or did they make it up?
Well, I don't like the Cuban government, so I played the first.
Got it.
Pozo, who goes by Niño, was sentenced to 26 years in prison for this. A lot of his teenage years and early 20s were spent in solitary confinement at the Kilo Siete prison in Camagüey.
One day, when Niño was alone in his prison cell, he was approached with a question.
And a sergeant came in the cell and said, "Hey, Mr. Pozo, you want to go to the United States?" And I told him, "Come on, man, don't play with me." He said, "Yes or no?"
Niño only had moments to decide whether or not to leave Cuban prison and head to the United States.
I said, "Well, if it's true, yes." He told me, "Put your clothes on," and I went outside. In the patio, there was a big bus. And from there, they took me to Mariel.
As he left that Camagüey prison cell and boarded a mysterious bus at age 22, change was brewing hundreds of miles to the west. It was the summer of 1980, and the Mariel Boatlift was underway. President Fidel Castro opened the country's doors, allowing thousands of citizens to leave Cuba for the United States every day. Soy Omar Granados.
And I'm Maureen McCullum. This is Uprooted from Wisconsin Public Radio. Up to now, Cuba has been a country that people had a hard time leaving. It's an island, and travel was a privilege reserved for a select few. Then suddenly, nearly 125,000 Cubans left their homeland for the United States as part of the Mariel Boatlift in 1980. Even Niño, who had been facing decades in prison, now has the chance to leave. At this point, 2 decades into the Cuban Revolution, the discontent that's been brewing among some Cubans is boiling over and prompting thousands to take drastic action.
From the beginning, the Cuban Revolution had promised people a better life, free healthcare, schools, and subsidized housing for everyone. And it was able to reach some of those goals. There's someone I want to bring in to help me explain this.
Sure. My name is Mike Bustamante.
Mike is Associate Professor of History and the Emilio Bacardi Moro Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami, plus the author of a new book,
Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile.
The book is a study of the ways Cubans have been fighting over their past, and specifically over the history of the Cuban Revolution since 1959.
I have the impression of the 70s, and even, sort of extending a little bit further into the early 1980s, is the time when, relatively speaking, socialism worked for most Cubans. When Cubans who had been educated under the socialist system in the 60s and through the 70s began to sort of see the fruits of their labor, when people of color, people from rural areas gained professional training and saw upward mobility. And there's a fair amount of data to substantiate that.
So even with the government providing new opportunities, plus free and subsidized things like food and housing, people still were not entirely satisfied.
There were goods people needed that they couldn't always get, at least not through the usual channels.
One has to keep in mind that under the sort of purviews of the socialist system, people aren't really paying rent in the way that you and I understand it. Many foodstuffs that people buy on a monthly basis are rationed and subsidized, which doesn't mean that they're enough or that there aren't shortages often. It doesn't mean that sort of the consumer options that people had available to them weren't very restricted. And it doesn't mean there wasn't incentives to participate in the kind of black market or petty theft activities that one could get in trouble for, right?
Remember Enrique More, who got in trouble for buying extra beers at a restaurant? This is why people started going off into the black market and found their own ways of getting things like beer.
Cubans also turned to the black market for everyday goods like toilet paper, rice, aspirin, or kids' notebooks for school.
So, if you work at a hospital, you may steal aspirin from work and then sell it into the black market. And to the Cuban government, that's people taking goods from the state, hurting the revolution.
What do you mean by hurting the revolution?
Well, any type of economic crime that deviates from the economic success of socialism, that means everyone should get the same. It's potentially dangerous to the state. But the dream of the 60s is running out of gas. It's not as easy as they'd promised. And there is an unhappy awakening of those particularly born and growing up in the revolution. Beginning in the early 70s, censorship becomes a frustrating reality for many.
1968 is the year, in March of 68, that Fidel Castro announces what's called the Revolutionary Offensive.
That's Lilian Guerra, author and professor of Cuban and Caribbean history at the University of Florida.
And part of that is the elimination and criminalization of all forms of economic micro-exchanges in which the government doesn't participate. So that means that you cannot, paint somebody's nails in your house or at what used to be your old little nail salon, because the nail salon's been nationalized and it's now a criminal offense that carries a great deal of weight for painting somebody's nails in your house and charging them money for it. Even bartering one service for another is a criminal act. And it is a criminal act because if you're going to be building communism, the government has to control all forms of economic exchanges. Anything that does that will limit the ability of the state to march forward towards this perfect communist utopia in which we'll have total egalitarianism.
So where did your mom go to get her nails done, Omar?
Well, she went to a state-run salon. A lot of the businesses of the revolutionary government were modeled off the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist bloc. This is a time in the 1970s when Cuba was becoming more and more dependent on the Soviet Union for food, staple goods, and appliances. Not to mention billions of dollars in aid that were dedicated to social services.
So how is the government enforcing these rules? Like, how are they preventing someone from running a salon out of their home?
They had eyes on the ground. Neighborhood watch is, in Cuba, very different than what it is in the United States. Other than the voluntary organized cleanups of the block or keeping in touch with each other, there is an element of surveillance and spying on people and reporting to the police and the government.
And everywhere across the island, people are persecuted and prosecuted. When I say persecuted, that means that their neighbors are denouncing them to the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution or to the local police for doing things that they've done for generations. So the system itself creates its own enemies because these men, largely men, who would be caught doing something illegal, as minimal as that, selling cigarettes, things like that, selling rations that people don't use. There was a cigarette ration. If you don't smoke, what do you do with your cigarettes? You committed this economic crime, so now you have to go do backbreaking labor for the state for a minimum wage because you're not a revolutionary. That would then further deepen their alienation and their distance from the state.
And then people just stop showing up for work. And then another thing happens in the early 70s that would get people in big trouble. It was essentially a law against laziness.
This is the law that would be applied to those men who refuse to go along with a government-owned economy.
People like Erne. Remember how he was sent to prison for taking a bike after his dad's funeral? Well, he ended up back in prison for stealing food from a state-run store and selling it on the black market.
I was 5 years in prison for no reason, or little reason. Because if you want to survive in Cuba, you had to steal or you had to do business black market, And I was stealing, but I never steal from my friend's house. I steal from the government because they're the one who have everything. And they catch me and send me to prison for 5 years.
Or people like Nino, who said he didn't want to cut sugarcane for communists.
Or they would simply be outside of the economy and unable to get back into it. And then they would be accused of being a lumpen, being, like a hanger-on, a parasite.
But pressure was not only at work. It was at home or hanging out with your friends.
By 1968, you're supposed to be a member of the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. You're supposed to do guard duty. You're supposed to give blood. You're supposed to do voluntary labor, either through your school or your workplace. You're supposed to be a member of the various organizations that touch on your identity. If you're a woman, you're supposed to be a member of the Federation of Cuban Women, et cetera, et cetera.
But there was also a Sovietization of culture taking place. I remember as a child of the 80s, playing chess as a kid and watching Russian cartoons, going to the ballet to see Russian ballerinas that I've never even dreamed of seeing now as an adult.
What was your favorite cartoon, Omar?
Oh, it was definitely Deja que te coja. The story of the bunny and the wolf was always chasing him through all aspects of Russian or Soviet culture.
Me las pagarás.
So, Omar, at the same time that kids in the US are watching Scooby-Doo and listening to the Beatles, you're in an entirely different world culturally.
Yes, I didn't listen to the Beatles or really any music in English until the late 90s.
Wow, as a Beatle nerd, that's super hard for me to even fathom. What was one of the first Beatles songs you remember hearing? How old were you?
I was probably 25 years old when I heard Here Comes the Sun, and I loved it. It was a late discovery for me, and I remember I went to a big celebration that they were having in a public park in Havana to unveil a statue of John Lennon. I didn't even know that much about John Lennon at the time, and I had gone to the event to see my favorite singer, Silvio Rodriguez, who was playing a song by John Lennon, only to find out that Fidel Castro himself was unveiling the statue, and this was the year 2000.
President Fidel Castro surprised everyone by attending a tribute ceremony to the legendary musician John Lennon. The communist leader was joined by the Latin American folk singer Silvio Rodriguez to unveil a bronze statue of the former Beatle sitting on a park bench.
What did you take away from that moment?
Well, not only I was discovering who the Beatles were, but it was a moment of discovery for me as well, as a path to learn about all the censorship that had taken place in the 70s.
Lennon and the Beatles have always been popular in Cuba, even though the group's music was banned for a time on the nation's airwaves. But whether through foreign radio stations that could sometimes be heard or on secondhand records that passed among friends, Cuban fans always found a way to listen to Lennon.
Lillian Guerra explains why the Cuban government would want to limit the type of culture or entertainment that its residents have access to.
In communist systems, you cannot have economic or ideological or cultural autonomy from the state as a citizen. If you do that, you threaten the state. So the logic is that you have to have the state control the press, and the state has to control the economy, and it should control the culture. It should promote certain types of music. It should promote certain types of dance, and other things not promoted by the state are not allowed, and they're a threat. So I think you get a generation that by the late 70s is sort of fed up. And they also have very few choices about what they're going to do, how they're going to dress, what kind of music they can listen to, who they can hang out with, who they can love. And all of that is constantly reinforced and policed, and it is celebrated.
So even as people weren't allowed access to things like Beatles records or books, there was still a hunger for it.
And this is an example of the connection to Western and American culture Cubans have always had. It never went away. The path was narrow for people to leave Cuba and to get to know American culture, but it's always been there, starting with the Golden Exile.
Yeah, the Golden Exile was the first major emigration after the Cuban Revolution, lasting from 1959 until 1962. It was mostly middle and upper class, white Cubans who were supporters of ex-President Fulgencio Batista, or people who quickly realized the revolution was not for them. Then there were the freedom flights that took place from 1965 to 1973. During this time, Cubans had the opportunity to leave the island and emigrate to the U.S., hopping on flights from Havana to Miami.
So all those Cubans who left their homes and families after the revolution those people have built new lives and accumulated wealth in places like Miami and New Jersey. They obviously want to go back and visit. In 1979, they were given that opportunity.
They were known in Cuba by this euphemism, las visitas de la comunidad, the visits of the community. The community was sort of this new euphemism to refer to those who had left the country, which prior to that point, prior to the late 1970s, had been really referred to in Cuba by a lot more insulting terms. Worms, apátridas, literally people without a country.
Again, Michael Bustamante, who is an expert on las visitas de la comunidad. Up to this point, Cuban Americans who left after the revolution didn't have a real way to return home. So these visits were a big deal.
Over the course of a year, 100,000 Cuban exiles, Cuban Americans, go back to their home country that some haven't seen in the better part of 20 years. People are going back to see a country that they had left behind, going back to reconnecting with family that perhaps they had been able to keep in touch with. It's really sort of a clash of cultures and a clash of two worlds. And one of the things that the exiles bring when they come is they bring stuff, like literally gifts, appliances, clothes. And so, this is something that for people on the receiving end of that gift giving is kind of eye-opening in terms of contradicting the image that had been painted for them for years of what life was like, for working class folks in the capitalist West. And so they start to think, maybe there's something more.
Omar, did you get any of these gifts?
No, I didn't have any family in the United States. And it was a big deal for people, though. I remember the scarcity. In the late 1970s and mid-80s, we couldn't purchase certain items. Appliances like blenders or stereos. So if you went to school, for example, or you were playing with your friends and somebody had a Walkman or a video game, it was mind-blowing. You knew that person either had family in the United States or was the son or daughter of a famous musician or athlete that could travel, perhaps a diplomat.
And for older Cubans, it was a reminder of what the United States had to offer.
But there was a lot of letters that went back and forth. There were photos that went back and forth. So I think in those circumstances, one could imagine a family on the island getting a photo of someone, relative in Miami, posing in front of their new car. And quite deliberately, the family member in Miami sending a photo of them posing in front of their new car to say, we have arrived and we have triumphed.
That's exactly how it was. I remember as a kid seeing pictures of Cuban Americans and Cuban exiles with lots of gold chains and new cars.
But people weren't dreaming of leaving Cuba just because of stuff.
Michael Bustamante argues Cubans saw people coming and going freely, and that left a mark.
Cubans have grown up hearing that those who left are the enemies of the revolution, right? And then all of a sudden, 100,000 people come back who you have been told in school or, in your workplace or in the media are the enemies of the revolution. And they come back and they're welcomed to a certain degree. And they're bringing all this stuff. And then they can get on a plane and go back, right? Sort of in and out freely, just by paying for the trip, essentially. And so I think that also was probably somewhat of a shock to the system.
So you have a large number of Cubans who are already dissatisfied with the state of their lives and their country. They see people they know, friends, relatives, former coworkers, living in a very different world than the one they live in, and they can't unsee it. Then, in April of 1980, it all comes to a head. That's coming up after the break.
Hi, I'm Bridget Bowden, podcast host for WPR Reports. If you're enjoying Uprooted, then join me and Sean Johnson for Derailed. It's an investigative podcast about all the twists and turns in Wisconsin's saga for passenger rail. We tell the story of how the project came together, how it fell apart, and how it changed the state. To subscribe and find more, visit WPR.org/derailed or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Maureen McCullum. Thanks for joining me today on WPR Reports Uprooted. Together, we've heard personal accounts from some of the 15,000 Cubans who were sent to Wisconsin as part of the Mariel Boatlift. Stories of new starts, regrets, and the meaning of home. Support from listeners like you made today's program possible. Power free and independent journalism with your gift at WPR.org/donate. We've talked a lot about what happened in Cuba ahead of the Mariel Boatlift. So, in 1980, how did 125,000 Cubans leave the island for the United States, with about 15,000 of them ending up in Wisconsin?
So let's start with the actual facts of 1980, because they are themselves very revelatory.
Once again, Lillian Guerra, author and professor of Cuban and Caribbean history at the University of Florida.
March 8th, 1980, Fidel Castro gave a speech to the Federation of Cuban Women. It's International Women's Day. And in that speech, he says that in 1965, Cuba carried out a boat lift called Camarioca. And he says in that speech that perhaps repeating a Camarioca is necessary to get rid of the non-revolutionaries, of the people who just will not be swayed, of the people who are doubters, of the antisociales, the antisocials, those who are immune to political adoctrinamiento, which is indoctrination. And it may sound like a dirty little word, but in Cuba, that's what you found in your textbooks. That was a positive, that was dogma teaching. And so then, beyond that, so we know that he was already thinking about doing this, and getting rid of people who were discontented, I think, was part of a plan. However, I don't think that this high political elite had any clue the degree of discontentment there was, the anger, the outrage, what I would think is a major causative factor, which is political exhaustion on the part of young people, and anger over their inability to express that anywhere.
On April 1st, 1980, less than a month after Castro gave that speech, 6 people rammed a bus through the gates of the Peruvian embassy in Havana. It was one of many recent embassy breaches. These people, they were seeking asylum from the Peruvian government, thinking this was their only way out of Cuba.
And the Peruvian ambassador tells us that among the 6, there is a lesbian couple, that the state immediately, including Fidel, immediately begins to demand that these people be returned. They're accused by him in particular of being antisociales. And his response is, we're not returning anybody, because what is a crime in this country is not a crime anywhere else. And among the accusations against one of the women was that she had taken naked pictures of herself for another woman. So this was evidence of their ideological degeneracy, and he refuses to return them.
Instead, the Peruvian government granted these 6 Cubans asylum. Here's Cuban scholar Luis Aguilar León of Georgetown University speaking with NPR in 1980.
And then 6 more broke in, and they killed a guard. And so, as a show of anger and protest, the Cuban government removed the guards around the embassy.
And literally within minutes, according to Ambassador Pinto Basurco, a black Cuban man walks through the gates. And, he was astounded because one of the pillars, supposed pillars of revolutionary support was black people. And he would be, in fact, he would be stunned at the percentage, the numbers that would come.
And in a matter of 3 hours, the simple news, unexpectedly, without any preparation, that an embassy was open, provoked, to the horror of the Peruvian ambassador, a wave of people. They didn't wait for anything else. Just an embassy is open, and they moved.
On the island of Cuba, the revolution of Fidel Castro has suffered a major embarrassment. Thousands of Cubans have flooded the embassy compound of Peru, hoping to get out of the country. Even after 20 years of socialistic indoctrination, much dissatisfaction exists.
More than 10,000 people quickly packed into an area that is roughly the size of a football field. The Cuban government had to act fast. It was quickly turning into a humanitarian crisis since people didn't bring food or water. Latin American countries began stepping in and saying they would welcome some refugees.
They have already appealed to the International Red Cross, and there is an urgent meeting of the Andean nations to give full cooperation to Peru.
Then, on April 14th, President Jimmy Carter's administration announced that the U.S. would take in 3,500 of the Peruvian embassy's asylum seekers as part of the Refugee Act of 1980.
We are the most generous nation on earth in receiving refugees, and I feel very deeply that this commitment should be maintained. Ours is a country of refugees. Many of those in this room have either parents or grandparents who were refugees, who came here looking for a new life of freedom, a chance to worship as they pleased, or a chance to combine their own talents to build a growing and dynamic country. Those of us who have been here for a generation or 6 or 8 generations ought to have just as open a heart to receive the new refugees as our ancestors were received in the past.
All right, so finally, on April 20th, Castro opens the doors to his country and tells exiles in Florida that they can come pick up their relatives in Cuba. Again, Michael Bustamante.
The fact that within 48 hours, after April 1st and the break-in of the Peruvian embassy, which is the detonator for the boat lift, 10,000 people have occupied the embassy. I know that this was an expression of a scale of frustration and discontent, at least on the part of some sectors of the Cuban population, that took the Cuban government by surprise. And I don't think it's something that the Cuban state was prepared for, certainly.
The first boatload, containing mostly men, arrived yesterday in Key West, Florida, aboard lobster boats piloted by Cuban exiles. NPR's Jo Maglino is in Key West. She says more craft are expected to make the journey in what could build into a Dunkirk-like evacuation.
Back at the port of Mariel, a flotilla emerges very quickly, and hundreds of boats are arriving at the shores of Mariel to pick people up. Thousands of people begin to leave Cuba every day.
So that then unleashes what is the Mariel Boatlift that would run through October. And a total number of 124,779 Cubans would cross the Florida Straits. 86,000 of them, 448, would leave in May, which is the month of May alone. But it would continue. And what is so striking about it, too, is that people are coming from across the country. And it became as difficult to get to Havana. And it was just as difficult prior to Mariel, but to get to Havana was just as difficult as trying to leave the country. And people found their way. So it was an extremely geographically diverse population that left.
What had started as a way to get anti-government sentiment out of the country had become a mass exodus. But even so, the Cuban government decided to use this moment to send some people it considered troublemakers away, including people in psychiatric hospitals and those in prisons.
The mass exodus is seen as a blow to Cuban prestige worldwide, but Castro did not seem troubled at all. He said the immense majority of the disaffected Cubans are lumpens, antisocials, and delinquents. We don't want them, we don't need them, Castro said, suggesting that just about anyone who wants to leave can do so. George Guerra in Havana.
And that brings us back to the people we've met in this podcast. Erne, Armando, Enrique, and Nino.
Nino was in Kilo Siete prison for allegedly burning sugarcane fields as the Mariel Boatlift began. Suddenly, he was given a choice to leave Cuba for the United States. He told his family he was leaving.
I told my mama come and see me in May. And she told me, I rumor that people going to the United States, are you leaving? And I told her, I'm sorry. I told my mama, no, but my brother was there, so when my mama went to the bathroom, I told my brother, man, I gotta leave, man, I don't got no choice. He told me, okay, but not told my mama.
Nino felt like he didn't have a choice. He had to go. Ernesto Rodriguez, the one who took a bicycle to get back to the army after his father died, he was also in prison when the Mariel Boatlift began.
I was in prison when I heard there was 200 boats in Mariel. I heard that Castro was open the door because Jimmy Carter said, you can send those people. But Fidel said, okay, you wanted everybody? Okay. He take a lot of people from prison, crazy people, murder people to America, you know.
He had to make a split-second decision on whether or not to go to the United States.
And then when they ask me, you want to leave Cuba? I go, yeah, because I don't want to be there. I say, okay, sign it here. We're going to send you to the cell until you have to go. Yeah, we know, and wait in a little room for 2 weeks, sleep in the floor.
After deciding to leave Cuba, to leave their families, their friends, the only home they'd ever known, the time came for the exiles to make their way to the port of Mariel. But Ernesto says on the journey to the port, he didn't exactly receive a fond farewell from his fellow Cubans.
People was throwing rock and eggs. Get out of here, you Korea, you don't like the government. Get out of here, we don't want you here.
The anger directed at their neighbors and co-workers who were choosing to leave seemed to come from a sense of rejection, of betrayal, a betrayal that was at once personal as well as political.
Just as it had done in the past, Castro's propaganda machine was disparaging the people that wanted to live in Mariel, calling them scum or escoria or undesirables. Again, Lilian Guerra.
But they would surround your home and they would spray paint the front of your house with government-supplied spray paint. And they'd write traitor, they'd write gusano, which means worm. They'd write homosexual, antisocial, lumpen. And they'd throw eggs at it. They'd chant for hours. Sometimes they'd cut off your electricity and your water. They would terrify you. And that would be the case until you were actually allowed to leave.
And this was their goodbye. Do you remember any of this, Omar?
I do, very vaguely. I was only 5 years old when Mariel happened, and, I was just a kid watching people being demonstrated against on the street and mobs of people throwing eggs and screaming at those who had chosen to leave Cuba. When I left Cuba to go to school in the United States, many years later, no one was throwing eggs at me. People were excited for me because I had made it. Honestly, I didn't know much about Mariel until I moved here. They don't tell the story in Cuba.
Once they made it to the port of Mariel, people like Ernesto and Nino saw hundreds of boats waiting to take them across the Florida Straits to the United States.
I stayed there one night, then the next day in the morning, about 8 o'clock, they put me in the line and said, okay, you see the boat over there? Get in there.
In the next episode of Uprooted, the Cubans experience a treacherous boat ride.
Now boats were being seriously overloaded, forced to take unwanted extra passengers.
And eventually land in Florida, where their welcome to the United States isn't much better than their farewell in Cuba.
And I think what we ought to do is just bring them off the boat, paint them red, white, and blue, and say they're Americans.
Uprooted is reported, written, and produced by me, executive producer Maureen McCollum, along with Omar Granados. Our producer and technical director is Brad Kohlberg. We're edited by Brady Carlson. Music direction and composition by Carl Christensen. Additional support from Adam Friedrich, Peter Bryant, Hannah Haynes, and Ezra Wall. Digital editing by Alyssa Alamand. The digital design team is Jane Jumale, Amanda Starrich, and Anna Rudin. Digital direction by David Highland. Photography by Angela Major, and special thanks to the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse's Murphy Library for archival photos. Artwork by Grace Lorenz. Our theme music is the song Pozo Part 3 by Willie Chirino. Additional music from La Familia Valera Miranda, The Beatles, and John Lennon. Archival audio from NPR's Research, Archives, and Data Strategy team. You can see more at WPR.org/uprooted.